There's an idea that causes a surprising amount of frustration in life. The idea that eventually something is going to get finished or will come to an end. Business is going to get built, body gets fit and healthy, maybe a relationship becomes secure, a house gets sorted, a career is established. You may have found yourself saying, when the money comes in and it's all sorted, all of our problems will be resolved. When that happens, life will finally settle into some kind of permanent, completed state. I think we all know intellectually that life doesn't really work that way, but emotionally, we often behave as though it does. We keep imagining a future point at which the effort will no longer be required, a point in time where everything important has been handled and the system is just going to simply continue working. But here's the thing, there is no finished state. There's only growth, maintenance, and decay. Everything, and I do mean everything, that we value requires energy. A business requires attention. Your body requires movement, exercise, and nutrition. A relationship requires presence and attention. A skill requires practice. A reputation requires standards. A community requires participation. And of course, a life needs direction. The moment that energy stops entering a system, that system begins to change. Sometimes the change is immediate. However, usually it's gradual, sneaks up. That is partly why it's so difficult to detect it, because you see, nothing seems to collapse on the first day. A business doesn't usually fail because the owner stopped paying attention for one afternoon, does it? A relationship doesn't usually disappear because of one distracted conversation. And a body doesn't lose all of its strength because of one missed training session. The decline or the decay is subtle most of the time. The plate continues spinning. The problem is that it starts to spin slightly more slowly than before. And because it's still moving, well, we tell ourselves that everything's fine. And then when you look at it, you realize that a large part of modern life is organized around arrival or an end result. You go to school so that you can pass your exams. You pass your exams so that you can get into university. You go to university so you can get a job. Get a job so you can build a career. Build a career so that you can earn more money, buy a house, and then feel secure. And then perhaps you build a business, raise a family, pursue a promotion at work, or work towards retirement. Each stage is presented as though it will resolve the tension that's been created by the previous one. And once you get there, you'll be settled, or at least that's the thinking. Once you achieve that, you'll be complete. Once this period is over, things will become easier. But the thing is that arrival is usually much shorter than anticipated. You reach the milestone, there's some relief, there's some excitement, there may even be some celebration, but then the structure that carried you towards that milestone disappears, and almost immediately a new question appears. What now? This is particularly visible at major transitions. A student spends years working towards graduation. The day arrives, there's ceremony, applause, photographs, pride and relief. But underneath the celebration, another process has already begun. The university has stopped feeding structure into that person's life. No more timetable, no more terms, no more assignments, no more academic calendar. No next stage automatically placed in front of them. The energy source has been removed. That space has to be filled by something. Work, further study, a project, a new community, a new sense of purpose. And without that replacement, the apparent completion can quickly become drift. That is not because graduation was meaningless. Of course it wasn't. It mattered. But it wasn't a permanent state. It was a transition. And I think we make a mistake when we treat major achievements as destinations rather than transfer points. As much as they're endings, they're also beginnings. And this principle is clearly visible in the physical world. I've been building a house in my spare time, and when you do this, you quickly realize that if you leave a house unmaintained, well, it deteriorates. If you don't clean it up, repair it, heat it, check the roof, or deal with the damp, for a while at least, it will seem like nothing's happened. It will seem unchanged. But underneath the surface, entropy is increasing. The paint begins to crack. Water gets inside. Metal starts to rust. Wood moves and shifts in place. Dust accumulates, and nature begins the process of reclaiming what has been abandoned. The house doesn't remain in neutral condition. It moves towards disorder. And the same is true of a garden. The moment you stop deciding what grows there, something else starts deciding for you, doesn't it? Weeds don't require a strategy meeting. They don't need motivation. They simply occupy available space. And yeah, that's a useful metaphor for life. When you stop consciously directing attention, something else will usually claim it. When you stop shaping a culture, an informal culture emerges. When you stop managing money, spending habits take over. When you stop choosing how to use technology, technology begins choosing how to use you. Something particularly important in this AI age that we're now firmly embedded in. When you stop maintaining a relationship, convenience and distance begin to shape it for you. An unattended system, left to fend for itself, doesn't remain in perfect suspension. It continues moving, just not necessarily in the direction that you would have chosen. Now, I want you to think about this. Momentum is stored energy. Because honestly, what I've been saying so far, well, it could sound a little bit miserable, couldn't it? But ask yourself this. If everything decays, does that mean that we have to work relentlessly just to prevent the collapse of whatever system that we're in? Well, no, because systems can store momentum. That is one of the most valuable things about building something properly. You see, a business with strong systems can continue operating while the owner steps back temporarily. A trained body can tolerate a short break without losing all of its capacity, fitness, and strength. A strong relationship can survive periods of stress and distraction and even distance. And a good reputation can continue creating trust long after the specific actions that built it have gone. Because you see, momentum creates resilience. I've mentioned it before, and it's a good analogy. Think of spinning plates. At the beginning, you have to supply energy. You might even say a significant amount of energy. You turn it, you guide it, you correct it. But once it's spinning, it can continue for a while without constant intervention, can't it? Then you can move to another plate. You can attend to something else. You can rest a little if you choose. That stored momentum creates some freedom. However, it doesn't create permanence, does it? Eventually, the plate begins to slow down. It might start to wobble a little. And if you catch it early, merely a small amount of energy is required to restore the motion to where it once was. But if you ignore it, that correction becomes far more difficult. It requires more skill and it uses more energy. And of course, if you leave it long enough, the plate's going to fall down. This is the hidden benefit of momentum. It allows you to temporarily take your foot off the gas, but it also contains a danger because things that are still moving can create the illusion that they no longer need you. There's a particular moment in the life of, well, almost every project, business, habit, or relationship when initial effort begins to produce visible results. And this is often when people reduce the energy that they're supplying. At first, they had to work really hard. They had to be deliberate. They had to remember, create structure. And then, all being well, the structure starts to work. The business attracts a few customers. The exercise routine produces some results. Maybe the content begins reaching people that find it interesting. Maybe the relationship starts to feel strong and secure. Whatever it is, the person starts to think, perhaps unconsciously, good, that's sorted. Their attention moves elsewhere, and for a while at least, nothing bad happens. The system is running on momentum, but because there's no immediate penalty, the reduction in attention feels harmless. That is, until performance begins to soften. Maybe a few customers leave, the training becomes less consistent, the content becomes repetitive, the relationship becomes functional rather than close. The team begins making decisions based on convenience. Still nothing dramatic happens, so no intervention occurs because it doesn't feel necessary. And then, one day, the decline becomes visible. The person experiences it as sudden. They say the business suddenly slowed down. The relationship suddenly became distant. Their fitness suddenly dropped. Their audience suddenly stopped responding. But the event wasn't sudden. The visibility was sudden. The process had been happening for much longer. And that is why maintenance is less emotionally rewarding than rescue. Rescue feels dramatic. It feels urgent. It creates urgency. There's a clear problem and an obvious need for action. Maintenance is much quieter. It asks you to supply energy while the system still appears healthy, and that requires judgment. And the thing is, human beings are not naturally excited by maintenance. Maintenance rarely creates a dramatic before and after story. Nobody applauds because the roof didn't leak this year. Nobody gives you an award because your accounts remained accurate. No one notices that a relationship continued working because both people dealt with small tensions before they became big ones. Maintenance is invisible when it succeeds, and it only becomes visible when it fails. And that creates a strange incentive. We often reward people for solving crises that good maintenance might have prevented. The heroic manager fixes the emergency. The exhausted founder rescues the launch. The partner makes a grand gesture after months of neglect. The person begins an extreme health regime after years of gradual decline. All of these can look really impressive. But try this on for a moment. Heroism is often expensive maintenance delivered late. Now, a mature system reduces the need for heroics. It notices subtle drift early. It applies smaller corrections. It builds routines that continue even when enthusiasm is absent. Look, it's not glamorous, okay? It's effective. I find it useful to think about important areas of life as existing in one of three states: growth, maintenance, or decay. And growth means that the system is gaining capability, energy, value, or resilience. Maintenance means enough energy is entering to preserve the current condition. And decay means that the energy entering is insufficient to offset the forces that are pulling that system apart. These states can be deceptive though. Growth isn't always obvious. A person may be learning slowly, building a foundation that hasn't yet produced visible results. Maintenance can look like failure because there's no dramatic improvement. And decay can look like success because the system is still benefiting from previous momentum. A profitable business can already be decaying. A strong body can already be decaying. A popular brand can already be on its way out. And a relationship can look intact and healthy from the outside while losing energy internally. And that is why results alone are not always reliable. You have to examine the direction of travel. Is capability increasing? Is trust increasing? Is skill increasing? Is attention increasing? Is the system becoming more robust, or are we simply spending what was built earlier? This leads to a concept I think is important: borrowed performance. Borrowed performance is when current results are being produced by consuming future capacity. A person works excessive hours to hit a deadline. The project succeeds, but their health, their judgment, and their relationships deteriorate. A company cuts training, maintenance, and product development to improve short-term profit. The accounts look stronger, but the organization is becoming less capable. A leader creates performance through fear. The team works harder, but trust, creativity, and retention are failing and falling. A person uses stimulants, stress, and anxiety to keep producing. They appear disciplined, but the system is running beyond its sustainable limits. In each case, the result is real, but the method is consuming the machinery that produced the result. That is borrowed performance, and it's not sustainable. It looks like progress because the output is visible and the cost is delayed. Many businesses operate this way for years. They celebrate revenue while customer goodwill declines. They celebrate growth while operational complexity increases. The problem isn't ambition. The problem is failing to distinguish between performance that builds capacity and performance that spends it. Sustainable momentum requires two things that are often treated as opposites: pressure and recovery. You need enough pressure to create movement, because without demand, there's no adaptation. Without deadlines, standards, or challenge, many systems become lazy. But pressure without recovery damages a system. The body becomes stronger when training stress is followed by repair and recovery time, right? Learning improves when focused effort is followed by some period of consolidation. Businesses develop when periods of intense creation are followed by a period of refinement and stabilization. A relationship can survive difficult conversations when there's also safety, warmth, and reconnection. The aim isn't to remove pressure, it's to create a rhythm that the system can absorb. Despite what you've convinced yourself of, okay, constant maximum effort is not momentum, it's emergency. And emergencies are useful only when they're temporary. The challenge is that urgency can become addictive. Urgency simplifies decisions. Everything feels important. There's no need to think deeply because the next action is so obvious. Solve the immediate problem, answer the message, fix the mistake, hit the deadline, fight the fire. Then, when the emergency ends, the person feels strangely empty, without pressure, and really know what to do. So guess what? They recreate it, they delay, they overcommit, they launch too quickly, they allow small problems to become large ones. The crisis returns, and with it comes focus. That is not sustainable momentum. It's repeated instability. But if systems need energy, where does rest fit? Rest isn't the absence of responsibility. It's a part of maintenance. The system that never recovers eventually loses capacity. But there's difference between deliberate rest and unplanned withdrawal. Deliberate rest has a purpose. You reduce pressure so that energy can be restored. You step back while maintaining awareness. You know what is pausing and what must continue. And then you return before the system loses too much momentum. Withdrawal is altogether different. Withdrawal often begins as rest, but has no clear boundary. You stop looking, you avoid the information, you tell yourself you'll return when you feel more motivated. Because the system continues moving temporarily, there's no immediate consequence. But then it happens. The distance becomes harder to recover from. An undefined break can become 6 months. It also can happen with content. A deliberate pause can restore ideas and give fresh inspiration. However, an unplanned disappearance can weaken the relationship with the audience. It also happens with money. A brief break from detailed tracking, that's harmless enough, right? But avoiding the accounts because they create discomfort, well, that's something completely different. Rest restores capacity. Avoidance protects you from discomfort whilst allowing entropy to increase. The behaviour may look similar from the outside, but the direction is completely different. And there's another side to this as well. Not everything should be maintained. Sometimes the language of discipline becomes a trap. We assume that because we started something, we have to continue feeding it forever. A business, a project, a subscription, a relationship, a public commitment, a version of ourselves that no longer fits. The fact that something requires energy doesn't mean it deserves that energy. Sometimes decay is information. The project keeps slowing because we no longer believe in it. The habit disappears because it was badly designed. The business struggles because the market's changed. The relationship can't be restored by effort from only one side. The identity was built for a period of life that has ended. The intelligent response is not always to spin the plate faster. Sometimes it's to stop and put the plate down. This is difficult because we confuse stopping with failure. But continuing to invest in something simply because we've already invested in it, well, that's not discipline. It's often fear. Fear of admitting that the decision might have been wrong. Fear of disappointing people. Fear of losing status. Fear of the empty space that appears when something ends. The question isn't, can this be maintained? Almost anything can be maintained if enough energy is supplied. The better question is, what does maintaining this prevent me from building? Every commitment has an opportunity cost. Every plate consumes attention, even when it's spinning well. The more things you maintain, the less energy is available for growth. A useful exercise is to conduct what I call a plate audit. Look at the major areas of your life and work: your health, primary relationship, family, business, finances, reputation, home, friendships, major projects, and then ask 3 questions. First, is this growing, being maintained, or decaying? Not how does it look? Not how do I hope it's happening? What is the actual direction? Second, what energy is currently feeding it? Is it time, money, attention, conversation, practice, systems, or emotional effort? And then third, does it still deserve that energy? Now, that final question matters. Some things are decaying because they've been neglected. Others are decaying because they should be allowed to end. The audit isn't designed to produce guilt. It's designed to improve allocation. You can't apply maximum effort everywhere. That's just fantasy. The goal is to understand where a small amount of energy will preserve something valuable, where greater investment could create growth, and where withdrawal would create space for movement. Balance is often misunderstood, in my opinion. People imagine balance as equal attention given to every area of life every day, but that's not realistic. A launch might require a period of intense business focus. A family crisis may temporarily override professional goals. A health problem may demand immediate attention. A new child changes almost everything overnight. A major creative project may require temporary obsession. Life tends to move in seasons. The goal isn't about equal effort. The goal is conscious imbalance. You know what's receiving more energy. You know what's receiving less. You know how long that arrangement can continue, and you know what minimum maintenance is required to prevent important systems from collapsing. That is very different from accidental imbalance. Accidental imbalance happens when the loudest problem shouts the loudest and captures all the available attention. You keep responding to urgency, and everything else slowly decays. Then one of the neglected areas becomes the new emergency. Your life becomes a sequence of ups and downs, of rescue operations. Conscious imbalance, though, says for the next 6 weeks, this project is going to receive more attention than that one. During that period, these other areas will operate at maintenance level, and that's fine. These are non-negotiable actions that keep them stable. And at the end of the 6 weeks, I'm going to reassess it. That is a system. This principle matters particularly in business. Businesses often confuse activity with momentum. A full diary, a large number of meetings, constant social media output, new products, campaigns, software, ideas, all of that can create the feeling of movement. But motion is not necessarily momentum. Momentum requires direction. A business has momentum when effort is accumulating, when the work done today makes tomorrow's work more effective. A good system creates momentum. A strong customer relationship creates momentum. A recognizable brand creates momentum. A useful body of content creates momentum as well. And by contrast, repetitive work that disappears as soon as it's completed may create output but very little momentum. If every sale requires the same amount of effort as the first one, the system hasn't accumulated much leverage. If every piece of content is isolated, the audience isn't being carried through to a larger body of thinking. And if every employee has to rediscover the process, the organization isn't learning. The question isn't simply, what are we doing? It's, what are we building that continues working after today? This is especially relevant to content. Many people approach content as a daily obligation. What can I post today? They create something, they publish it, then the process resets to zero. Tomorrow, they need another idea. That's exhausting because nothing is accumulating. A far better approach is to build a body of work, one idea that leads to another. A long form episode can become shorter clips. A newsletter develops an argument. A framework becomes a downloadable tool. Audience questions shape the next questions and the next episodes. Over time, the individual pieces begin to reinforce one another. That creates intellectual momentum. A person is no longer simply feeding a platform, they're building an asset. This is part of what I want to do here. Establish a wider territory. This episode introduces the idea of momentum and entropy, and future episodes can examine specific parts of that idea. Borrowed performance, the danger point in spinning plays, the role of recovery, how to restart after disruption, how to decide what to stop, and how organizations decay while appearing successful. The content begins to form a connected, a coherent system. Let me give you another perspective, because health provides another really clear example of this. People often approach fitness as a temporary intervention. They go on a diet, they complete a program, maybe they train for an event, they reach a target weight. The target creates focus, right? Then the target gets achieved and the structure collapses. Structure disappears because the result has been reached. The behavior that created it feels less urgent. And slowly the old pattern returns. This is often described as a failure of willpower, but honestly, it's more often a failure of system design. The person created a path to a destination, but no plan for living there, maintaining it. Growth and maintenance are very different tasks. They require different energy. The routine required to lose weight may not be the routine needed to maintain it. The training required to prepare for an event may not be sustainable forever. The discipline required during a short, intense program may be inappropriate as a permanent lifestyle. A person needs a transfer from growth mode into maintenance mode, and without that transition, success contains the conditions for relapse. Same is true in business. A launch strategy is not an operating strategy. A turnaround plan is not a long-term culture. A period of crisis management is not a sustainable leadership model. You can't simply continue doing the growth intervention forever. But you can't remove it either without replacing it with something that maintains it, some maintenance. One of the most important moments in any transition is the loss of an external structure. School provides structure, university provides structure, employment provides structure. A training program does, competition, demanding project, caregiving role provides structure. And when that structure ends, the energy it supplied ends with it. It disappears. People often interpret the resulting loss of direction as a personal weakness. They think they've become lazy. They think that they've lost motivation. But sometimes what they've lost is architecture. The deadlines are gone. The social accountability is gone. The next step is no longer clearly defined. The environment no longer cues the behaviour. And in those moments, the solution is not always more motivation. It's replacement structure, a new timetable, a new commitment, a new project, a new community, a new reason to get up in the morning. That is why retirement can be so difficult. A person may have spent decades imagining freedom from work, and then when it ends, and it takes with it routine, status, social contact, challenge and identity. The problem isn't simply having too much free time. The system that organised life has disappeared. Something has to replace it. Identity is also maintained. We tend to think of identity as something that we are, but identity is partly something that we do, something that we repeatedly enact. A person sees themselves as disciplined because they continue doing difficult things. They see themselves as creative because they continue creating. They see themselves as reliable because they keep promises. Maybe they see themselves as fit because movement remains part of life. When the behaviours stop, identity may continue for a while. The person still thinks of themselves as an athlete, an entrepreneur, a musician, or a leader, but without repeated evidence, the identity slowly becomes historical. It describes who they were, not what they do. This doesn't mean identity should be rigid. In fact, the ability to release an old identity can be essential. But it does mean that we should recognize that identity requires reinforcement, maintenance. You become what your repeated actions continue to prove. That is one reason small maintenance habits matter. They preserve the relationship between intention and identity. A short training session says, I'm still somebody who trains. A weekly conversation says, this relationship still matters. A regular review says, I'm still directing this business. A page of writing says, I'm still a writer. The action may be small, the identity signal is huge. When a system can't receive full attention, the useful question becomes, what is the minimum effective input? What's the smallest action that preserves continuity? For health, it may be 3 short training sessions rather than an ambitious 6-day program. For a relationship, it might be 1 protected evening, a date night, and a regular honest conversation. For a business, it might be a weekly review of cash sales, delivery and risks. For learning, it may be 20 minutes of deliberate practice. For content, it may be 1 substantial piece of work each week rather than daily low quality output. The minimum effective input is not the ideal. It's the amount required to prevent drift during a demanding season. This matters because all or nothing thinking destroys continuity. If the full workout is impossible, the person does nothing. If the full strategy can't be implemented, the business abandons planning. If a long conversation isn't possible, the relationship gets no meaningful attention. Small inputs are dismissed because they seem inadequate, but small energy, little and often, applied consistently, can preserve momentum. The plate doesn't always need a dramatic spin. Sometimes it just needs a touch. The earlier you detect drift, the cheaper the correction. And that means systems need indicators. Businesses have financial indicators, but they also need indicators of customer trust, staff capability, product quality and operational strain. Health has obvious indicators such as weight, strength, speed, blood pressure and sleep. Relationships have indicators too, although they're rarely measured formally. Frequency of conflict, quality of conversation, affection, resentment, avoidance, the amount of life being shared. Personal direction also has indicators. Energy, sense of progress, the ability to focus, number of commitments being avoided. Problem is that we often ignore them because they're inconvenient. We know that the plate is wobbling, we hear it, we see it, but we're busy spinning something else. The intervention feels as though it can wait until it can't. One practical way to reduce this is a weekly review, not an elaborate productivity ritual, a simple examination of the systems that matter. What gained momentum this week? What lost momentum? What did I neglect? What requires intervention? What can continue coasting? What should stop? What am I avoiding? Where am I borrowing performance from the future? These questions create a pause between experience and repetition. Without review, weeks can become indistinguishable. The person remains active, but direction becomes unclear, and a review restores authorship. It allows you to decide where the next unit of energy should go. And that decision is central because attention is finite. The problem is rarely that there's no energy anywhere. The problem is that energy is being allocated unconsciously. Motivation is unreliable. Standards are far more durable. A standard is a decision made in advance about what will be maintained. I train even when the session isn't perfect. I review the business every week regardless. I answer important problems rather than hiding from them. Standards reduce negotiation. They're particularly valuable when momentum is low. When things are going well, motivation and momentum can carry behaviour. When things are slowing, standards become the bridge. They preserve action until the feeling returns. But standards need to be realistic. A standard that can be maintained only under ideal conditions is not a standard, it's an aspiration. A useful standard survives ordinary disruption, travel, fatigue, work pressure, low mood. It can flex, but it doesn't disappear. Sometimes the plate has already fallen, the business has already declined, the routine has disappeared, the relationship has become distant, and maybe the project has stalled. In those moments, people often waste energy on self-judgment. They compare their current state with their previous best. The gap feels humiliating. They try to restart at the level that they once maintained, but it creates too much friction. The attempt fails. The failure confirms the belief that they've lost something essential. A better restart begins with reality. What capacity exists right now? What is the next repeatable action? Not the action that would impress people, not the action that recreates the old identity immediately, the action that can actually be sustained and maintained. Momentum has to be rebuilt. At first, this may be painfully slow, but the aim is not to perform at the previous level on day one. The aim is to create another day of movement, then another, and then another still. And eventually the system begins storing energy again. And this brings us back to endings. Every ending releases energy. A project concludes, a child grows up, a course finishes, a business is sold, a role changes. The energy that was attached to that structure becomes available again. And that can feel like freedom, but it can also feel like emptiness. The question is where that energy goes next, not necessarily immediately. There should be room for celebration, for grief, for reflection and rest. But eventually, the system needs a new direction. The next chapter matters because entropy doesn't pause while we decide who we are now. Something will come in and fill the space. The only question is whether it's something that you choose or something inevitable because of the entropy that's increasing. Nothing stays finished. That is not a defect in life. It's one of its defining conditions. Everything important is alive in some sense. It changes, responds, requires energy. The goal isn't to reach a permanent state where no further effort is necessary. The goal is to become better at directing effort, to know what needs growth, what needs maintenance, what can coast, what's beginning to wobble, and what should be allowed to end. Momentum gives us freedom. It allows previous effort to continue carrying us. But momentum isn't permanent. Eventually, the plate's going to need another spin, another touch. The business is going to need some attention. The body's going to need some movement. The relationship is going to need some presence. The mind needs challenge. The life needs direction. The question isn't whether you can keep every plate spinning forever. You can't. The question is whether you're consciously choosing where your energy goes. Because there's no finished state. There's only growth, maintenance, and decay. And the quality of a life is shaped in a large part by knowing which of those processes is happening before the plate hits the floor.